photograph you're looking at captured a singer's worst nightmare. Look at Frank Sinatra's face. His mouth is wide open, veins bulging in his neck, hands gripping the microphone like he's drowning, and it's the only thing keeping him afloat. But no sound is coming out. Nothing. Frank Sinatra, the man with the most famous voice in America, has opened his mouth to sing, and his voice is gone. Not weak, not raspy, gone. 500 people are watching. The orchestra is frozen behind him. The spotlight is burning down on him, and Frank is standing there in complete silence, experiencing every performer's worst nightmare in real time. This isn't just a bad performance. This is a career ending on stage, a voice hemorrhaging, a dream dying, a legend collapsing. In this moment, Frank Sinatra believes his life is over. The Bobby Soxer idol who made millions of girls scream, the voice that dominated the 1940s, the skinny kid from Hoboken who became the biggest star in America, standing on stage, in silence, drowning. This is the story of how Frank Sinatra lost everything. His voice, his career, his marriage, his fortune, in one catastrophic moment, and how he somehow clawed his way back from the dead. But first, we have to understand how he got to this stage, how the biggest star in the world ended up standing in front of 500 people, unable to make a sound. To understand the moment Frank's voice failed, you need to understand that by April 1950, Frank Sinatra's life was already in free fall. Let's go back 3 years. Frank Sinatra was on top of the world. He was 31 years old, the highest paid entertainer in America. Girls fainted at his concerts, literally fainted, had to be carried out by paramedics. His records sold millions. He had a residency at the Paramount Theater, where crowds of screaming teenagers would line up around the block, sometimes camping out overnight just to see him. He had a beautiful wife, Nancy, and 3 young children, Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., and baby Tina. From the outside, he was living the American dream, but Frank was miserable, because in 1946, Frank Sinatra met Ava Gardner at a party in Los Angeles. Ava Gardner was the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, a movie star with MGM, glamorous, sophisticated, sexual, everything Nancy, the nice Italian girl from Jersey, wasn't. Ava was dangerous. She drank, she smoked, she cursed like a sailor. She'd been married twice already, to Mickey Rooney and to bandleader Artie Shaw. She had a reputation, and Frank became completely obsessed. At first it was just an affair, secret meetings at hotels, phone calls in the middle of the night. Frank would tell Nancy he had recording sessions, then spend the night with Ava. But the affair became public in 1948, when a photographer caught them leaving a restaurant together at 2 a.m. The headlines destroyed Frank. Sinatra cheating on wife with Hollywood siren, homewrecker. Ava steals Frank from his family. The scandal was massive. This was 1948. America was still very conservative. Divorce was scandalous. Adultery was career-ending. The Catholic Church condemned Frank publicly. Cardinal Spellman in New York gave a sermon specifically about Frank, calling him a moral degenerate who had abandoned his sacred vows. Radio stations across the country stopped playing his records. Concert promoters cancelled his bookings. Women's groups organized protests outside theaters showing his films. His fan clubs, those teenage girls who had made him famous, turned on him viciously. They felt betrayed. Their idol, their dream man, was just another cheating husband. Frank's record sales dropped by 75% in 6 months. But worse than the professional damage was the guilt. Frank loved his children, genuinely loved them, and he was abandoning them for Ava. Nancy Jr. was 7 years old. She'd cry every time Frank left the house. "Daddy, please don't go. Please stay with us." Frank would hug her, promise he'd be back soon, and then leave anyway. The guilt ate at him, but he couldn't stop. He was addicted to Ava. By late 1949, Frank had officially left Nancy and the kids, moved out of the family home in Toluca Lake, started living with Ava in a suite at the Hampshire House Hotel in New York. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Nancy's lawyers made sure every detail was in the papers: how much child support Frank would pay, how he'd left his family for another woman, how his children cried themselves to sleep at night asking for their daddy. And Frank's relationship with Ava was toxic from the start. They fought constantly, screaming matches that could be heard through the walls of their hotel. Neighbors complained, hotel staff gossiped. Ava was jealous and insecure despite being one of the most beautiful women in the world. She accused Frank of still sleeping with Nancy, of still being in love with his wife. "You call her every night to talk to the kids," Ava would scream. "What else are you doing when you call her?" "I'm talking to my children," Frank would shout back. "Bullshit. You're trying to get back together with her." Frank was equally jealous and controlling. When Ava was filming a movie, Frank would show up on set unannounced to make sure she wasn't flirting with her co-stars. He'd call her dressing room 20 times a day. One time, Ava went to a party without Frank. He called the venue repeatedly until someone put her on the phone. "Where are you?" Frank demanded. "At the party I told you about," Ava said. "Who are you with?" "People, Frank. I'm at a party. There are people here." "What men?" Frank's voice was dangerous. "I'm hanging up now," Ava said. "If you hang up, we're done," Frank threatened. Ava hung up. They broke up for 3 days, then got back together. The cycle repeated weekly, and through it all, Frank was drinking heavily. Whiskey became his constant companion. Jack Daniels started in the morning with coffee, continued all day, every day, to cope with the stress, to numb the guilt about his children, to quiet the voices telling him he was destroying his life, to calm his nerves before performances that weren't going well anymore, because the drinking was affecting his voice. In early 1949, Frank started noticing problems. His voice would crack during performances. He'd struggle with high notes he used to hit effortlessly. He'd get hoarse after singing just a few songs he used to perform for hours without strain. His manager, Frank Sinatra, noticed immediately. "Frank, your voice sounds different, rougher. You need to see a doctor." "I'm fine," Frank insisted. "Just tired. I've been working too hard." "Frank, your voice is your career. It's everything. If you damage it, everything's over. You understand that, right?" "I said I'm fine," Frank snapped. But he wasn't fine, and he knew it. By late 1949, Frank was also in serious financial trouble. His record sales had dropped by 80% from their peak. His film contracts weren't being renewed. The studios didn't want the controversy. Concert bookings had dried up to almost nothing, but his expenses hadn't changed. He was still paying the mortgage on Nancy's house, a massive place in Toluca Lake, still paying for the kids' private schools, their nannies, their everything. The divorce settlement was bleeding him dry. Plus, Ava's lifestyle. She was used to living like a movie star. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, 5-star hotels, first-class flights everywhere. Frank was spending $50,000 a month. He was making maybe $30,000. The math didn't work. And then the IRS came calling. Turned out Frank hadn't been paying his taxes properly. He owed over $100,000 in back taxes, plus penalties and interest. The IRS put a lien on his assets, started garnishing his income. By early 1950, Frank Sinatra, the man who'd made millions in the 1940s, was essentially broke. He needed work, desperately needed a major booking that would remind people why he'd been the biggest star in America. So when the Copacabana nightclub in New York offered him a 3-week engagement in April 1950, Frank jumped at it. The money was good. The venue was prestigious. It would be reviewed by all the major New York papers. It was supposed to be Frank's comeback. Instead, it became the nightmare that almost ended him forever. The Copacabana engagement was scheduled for 3 weeks, 21 shows, April 5th through April 26, 1950. From the very first night, Frank knew something was seriously wrong. His voice felt tight, strained, like someone had wrapped a rope around his throat and was slowly pulling it tighter. The high notes that used to come effortlessly now required real physical effort. He could feel himself straining, could feel the veins in his neck bulging with the effort. After the first show, Frank went backstage and coughed into a towel. There was blood. Not a lot, just a few drops, but it was blood. Frank Sinatra saw it. "Frank, that's it. We're calling a doctor right now." "It's nothing," Frank said, hiding the towel. "Just pushed too hard on a high note. Blood is not nothing," Hank said. The next morning, Hank physically dragged Frank to a throat specialist, Dr. Irving Goldman, on Park Avenue. Dr. Goldman was one of the best ear, nose, and throat doctors in New York. He'd treated opera singers, Broadway stars, everyone. He examined Frank's throat with a scope, and his face went pale. "Mr. Sinatra, you have a vocal hemorrhage. A blood vessel in your vocal cord has ruptured. Do you understand what that means?" "Not really," Frank said, trying to sound casual, even though his heart was pounding. "It means you're bleeding inside your throat. The tissue is damaged, and if you continue to use your voice, especially to sing, you will make it significantly worse." "How much worse?" Frank asked. "You could permanently lose your ability to sing," Dr. Goldman said bluntly. "This isn't a sore throat, Mr. Sinatra. This is serious structural damage." Frank stared at him. "What are you telling me to do?" "Complete vocal rest. No singing, no talking. Absolute silence for at least 6 weeks, maybe 8. Frank laughed bitterly. 6 weeks? "Doc, I have shows tonight, tomorrow night, every night for the next 3 weeks. I can't just stop." "If you don't stop, you could permanently damage your voice," Dr. Goldman repeated. "You might never sing again. Is that clear enough for you?" The two men stared at each other. "So my choice is cancel the shows and admit I'm finished, or keep singing and maybe be finished anyway," Frank said. "Those aren't the only. This is serious." "I know it's serious," Frank said, "but if I cancel these shows, I'm done. Everyone will say I'm washed up, that I can't handle it anymore, that I'm yesterday's news." "Better yesterday's news than no news at all," Hank said. "If you destroy your voice, you'll never work again." Frank didn't answer, just kept walking. That night, he went back on stage at the Copacabana, and for the next 2 weeks, Frank performed every single night, despite his voice getting progressively worse. Each show was agony. His throat felt like razor blades. Swallowing was painful. Speaking during the day made it worse, so Frank started communicating in whispers or just writing notes. Ava came to one of the shows in the second week, sat at a front table, watched Frank struggle through Old Man River. Backstage afterward, she didn't sugarcoat it. "Baby, you sounded awful," she said, lighting a cigarette. Frank's voice was barely a whisper from the strain. "I know. Then why are you doing this to yourself?" "I don't have a choice," Frank rasped. "I need the money. I need people to remember I still exist." "At what cost though?" Ava asked. "What's the point of being Frank Sinatra if you can't sing anymore? What's the point of being Frank Sinatra if nobody wants to hear me sing?" Frank shot back. They stared at each other. "I'm going back to LA tomorrow," Ava said. "I can't watch you destroy yourself like this." "Then go," Frank said. She did. The reviews were getting worse every night. Sinatra's voice, a shadow of former glory. The voice sounds strained, tired, old. Is this the end for Sinatra? Frank read every brutal word, and drank more whiskey. His doctor called him every day, begging him to stop. Frank ignored the calls. By the third week, late April, Frank's voice was hanging by a thread. He could barely speak during the day. His throat bled after every show, not just a little blood, but significant amounts. He'd cough into towels backstage, and they'd come away red. His band members were worried. His manager was frantic. The Copper management was getting nervous. But Frank had only 3 shows left. 3 more nights and the engagement would be over. He'd take the 6 weeks of vocal rest the doctor ordered, let his voice heal. He just had to survive 3 more shows. April 24, show went okay. Voice was rough, but he made it through. April 25, show was terrible. Frank cracked on multiple high notes, left the stage knowing it was the worst performance of his career. April 26, 1950, the final show of the engagement. Frank woke up that morning and tried to speak, could barely make a sound. His throat felt destroyed. He called Hank, whispered, "I don't think I can do tonight." "Then cancel," Hank said. "Tell them you're sick. It's the last show anyway." Frank hung up, stared at himself in the mirror. Cancel the last show, admit defeat, go out as a failure. No, Frank Sinatra would finish what he started. At 10 p.m., he walked into the Copacabana for his final performance. He had no idea it would be the last time he'd sing in public for almost a year. April 26, 1950. Telegiho. The Copacabana is absolutely packed. 500 people, every table full, standing room only. In the back, people have paid premium prices to see Frank Sinatra on his final night. Frank walks on stage to strong applause. He's wearing an immaculate tuxedo. Looks thin, too thin. His face is drawn, exhausted, older than his 34 years. But he smiles, waves to the crowd, takes the microphone. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he says. His speaking voice is hoarse but functional. "Barely. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is our last show of the run. Let's make it count." Applause, whistles. The orchestra, 16 pieces led by conductor Skitch Henderson, starts the intro. The first song is "I've Got a Crush on You," one of Frank's classic Gershwin standards, a song he's sung 1,000 times. An easy song, a safe choice to warm up his damaged voice. Frank brings the microphone to his lips. The crowd goes quiet, waiting for that famous voice. Frank opens his mouth, and nothing comes out. Not a weak note, not a crack, not even a whisper. Absolute silence. Frank's eyes widen in shock. He clears his throat, a painful, harsh sound that the microphone picks up. He tries again. Nothing. The orchestra keeps playing, waiting for him to come in on the second measure. Frank tries a third time, opens his mouth, strains. You can see the effort, the veins in his neck bulging, his face going red. A horrible, strangled sound comes out. Not singing, not even speaking, just a rasp, and then silence again. Complete silence. The orchestra falters. Some musicians stop playing, others keep going. Confused, the conductor looks up at Frank, baton frozen in midair. The audience starts murmuring, low at first, then louder. What's happening? Is he okay? Can't hear him. Is this part of the act? Frank stands there under the spotlight, mouth open, hand gripping the microphone stand so hard his knuckles have gone completely white. He tries one more time. Desperate now. He can feel his vocal cords, can feel them not responding, like trying to move a paralyzed limb. Nothing. The orchestra stops completely now. Total silence in the room except for the murmuring crowd. Frank's face shows something no one in that room had ever seen from Frank Sinatra before. Pure, undiluted terror. This isn't stage fright. This isn't nerves. This is physical catastrophe happening in real time. His career, his entire identity is ending right now, in this moment, in front of 500 witnesses. Frank tries to speak into the microphone. "I'm sorry, but even speaking is impossible." Only a faint whisper comes out, not even audible past the first row. The audience is getting restless now. Some people are standing up, craning to see what's wrong. Others are starting to leave, assuming the show is over. Someone in the back yells, "What's the matter, Frankie? Cat got your tongue?" A few people laugh nervously. Frank's eyes find that person in the crowd, and the look he gives them would have killed them if looks could kill. But he can't even yell back, can't defend himself, can't do anything. He's helpless. The orchestra conductor, Skitch Henderson, approaches the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be having a technical." Frank waves him away, shakes his head violently. He looks out at the audience one more time. 500 faces staring at him, some concerned, some confused, some already writing him off. And Frank makes a decision. He carefully sets down the microphone on its stand and walks off stage. Just walks away. Doesn't run, doesn't rush, just a slow, defeated walk into the wings. The audience sits in confused, uncomfortable silence, then scattered applause. Not for the performance. There was no performance, just polite applause because they don't know what else to do. The house lights come up. The show is over. Frank Sinatra, the voice, the biggest star of the 1940s, has just lost his voice completely in front of 500 people. And in his heart, he knows his career is over. Backstage, Frank made it exactly 10 steps before his legs gave out. He didn't fall dramatically, just sort of folded, sat down heavily on a wooden chair in the wings, and put his face in his hands. Stage hands stopped working. Musicians coming off stage froze. Everyone stared, because Frank Sinatra didn't break down. Frank Sinatra was cool, unflappable, the chairman of the board. But right now, Frank Sinatra looked shattered. Hank Sanicola ran over. "Frank, what happened out there?" Frank tried to speak, couldn't. His voice was completely gone. He gestured helplessly at his throat. "Get a doctor." Hank barked at someone. Now, the Copper's house doctor arrived within 5 minutes, a man named Dr. Rothstein, who handled medical emergencies at the club. The examination was quick and grim. Dr. Rothstein looked in Frank's throat with a light. His expression darkened. "Complete vocal hemorrhage," he said. "Severe. He needs to go to a hospital immediately. Mount Sinai is 10 minutes away." Frank shook his head violently, mouthed the word, "No, Mr. Sinatra, this is serious. You could have permanent damage. We need to." Frank stood up abruptly, pushed past the doctor, past Hank, past everyone trying to help. He stumbled to his dressing room, locked the door, and that's when the people outside heard something they would never forget. Frank Sinatra was sobbing, not quiet tears, deep wrenching sobs, the sound of complete breakdown. A man whose entire world had just collapsed. "Oh my God," one of the chorus girls whispered. "Is he?" "Give him space," Hank said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Just give him space." The sobbing continued for about 20 minutes. People stood in the hallway, not knowing what to do. Some cried themselves. Others just stood there in shocked silence. Inside the dressing room, Frank was experiencing the worst moment of his life. Worse than the scandal with Ava. Worse than the divorce from Nancy. Worse than anything, because everything else could be fixed. Relationships could be repaired. Money could be earned back. But if his voice was gone permanently, Frank Sinatra without his voice was just Frank, a failed singer from Hoboken, who'd thrown away his family for nothing. Finally, the sobbing stopped. The door opened slowly. Frank emerged. His eyes were red and swollen. His face was a mask. No expression at all. He walked to the dressing table, picked up a pen and paper, wrote, "Cancel any future bookings. I'm done." "Frank, we don't have to make decisions tonight," Hank started. Frank wrote again, "My career is over. Accept it. I have." "You don't know that," Hank said. "With treatment, with rest." Frank wrote one more line. "I know. It's over." He dropped the pen, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the Copacabana. Didn't say goodbye. Couldn't say goodbye. Just left. He walked through Manhattan for hours, through Times Square, past the Paramount Theater where thousands of girls used to scream his name, past record stores with his albums collecting dust in discount bins. At 4 a.m., he ended up on a bench in Central Park, staring at nothing. That's where Hank found him, still wearing his tuxedo from the show. "Frank, come on, let's get you home." Frank just shook his head, pointed to his throat, mouthed no home to go to, because Ava was in LA. His kids were in LA with Nancy. He had a hotel room, but it wasn't home. It was just a place where he slept. Frank had nothing, and now he had no voice to rebuild from. He was 34 years old, and he believed his life was over. 85, the diagnosis and darkness. The next morning, Hank physically dragged Frank to Dr. Goldman's office. The specialist examination was thorough and devastating. Dr. Goldman used a laryngoscope to look directly at Frank's vocal cords. What he saw made him wince. "Mr. Sinatra, you have a severely hemorrhaged vocal cord. The blood vessel damage is extensive. There's significant swelling and trauma to the tissue." Frank scribbled on a notepad, "Will it heal?" Dr. Goldman chose his words carefully. "The human body is remarkable. With proper rest, these tissues can repair themselves. But you've been singing through this injury for weeks, making it exponentially worse. You need complete vocal rest. No talking, no singing, no whispering for a minimum of 8 weeks, possibly 12. Frank wrote, and then we'll see." Dr. Goldman said honestly, "You might regain most of your vocal ability. But Mr. Sinatra, I need to be honest with you. Your voice will likely never be exactly what it was before. The damage is significant." Frank stared at the doctor, wrote, "How much of my voice will I get back?" "Percentage." Dr. Goldman hesitated. "If you follow my instructions perfectly, maybe 70–80% of your previous vocal ability. But that's best case scenario." Frank wrote, "And worst case?" "Worst case, you never sing professionally again." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Frank left the office and went straight to a bar on 52nd Street. He sat at the bar, couldn't drink, swallowing was too painful. But he sat there anyway, staring at a glass of whiskey he couldn't consume. The bartender recognized him. "Mr. Sinatra, you okay, pal?" Frank couldn't answer, just put a $20 bill on the bar and left. The next 8 weeks were the darkest period of Frank Sinatra's life. He couldn't speak, communicated entirely through writing on notepads. It was humiliating. Couldn't work, couldn't earn money. The bills kept coming anyway. The IRS demanding $100,000 in back taxes. Nancy demanding child support payments. The hotel demanding rent. Creditors calling every day. Frank couldn't even answer the phone. Ava stayed with him for exactly 11 days after the copper incident. Then she got bored and restless. "I can't just sit here watching you write on notepads," she said. "I'm going to LA. Call me when you can actually talk." She left. Frank was alone in his hotel room, silent, broke, abandoned. The press wrote obituaries for his career, gleeful, nasty obituaries. The voice that thrilled millions falls silent forever. Sinatra's career ends not with a bang but a whimper. From heartthrob to has-been, the tragedy of Frank Sinatra. Frank read every brutal word, believed every brutal word. By June 1950, Frank was genuinely suicidal. He'd written a note, had it ready in his wallet. One night, he stood on the balcony of his hotel room, 10th floor, looked down at the street. It would be easy, quick, all his problems would be over. But then he thought about his kids, Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., little Tina. What would they think? That their father was such a coward he couldn't face his failures? No. Frank stepped back from the balcony. Fuck them, he said out loud, the first words he'd spoken in weeks. His voice was a harsh whisper, but it was there. Fuck all of them. They want me to quit. They want me to disappear. I won't give them that satisfaction. It hurt to speak, but Frank kept talking. I'm Frank Sinatra, and I don't quit. July 1950. After 10 weeks of vocal rest, Frank tried to sing. He went to a private rehearsal studio, just him and a pianist named Bill Miller. Play I've Got a Crush on You, Frank said. His speaking voice was rough, damaged, but present. Bill started playing. Frank opened his mouth to sing, and sound came out. Not his old sound, not the smooth, effortless voice of the 1940s, but something, a raspy, textured, deeply emotional sound. Frank sang through the entire song. His voice cracked twice. He couldn't hit the highest notes, but he finished it. And Frank Sinatra, the man who'd thought he'd never sing again, started crying. It's still there, he said to Bill. My voice is still there. It's different, Bill said honestly. But Frank, it might be better. Frank looked at him. Better how? More soul, Bill said. The old voice was pretty. This voice has lived. Over the next year, Frank slowly rebuilt his career from nothing. It wasn't easy. Record labels didn't want him. Columbia Records dropped him. Film studios rejected him. He was reduced to playing small clubs in New Jersey for $500 a night, a fraction of his former fee. But Frank kept singing, kept working. His relationship with Ava continued its toxic cycle. They finally married in November 1951, but the marriage was doomed from the start. More jealousy, more fighting, more destruction. By 1952, Frank Sinatra was considered a has-been, a cautionary tale. But then came 1953. Frank read From Here to Eternity and knew the character of Maggio was his ticket back. He begged, pleaded, degraded himself to get that audition, offered to work for $8,000, nothing compared to his old salary. Columbia Pictures gave him a screen test just to shut him up. Frank walked onto that soundstage and poured everything into the performance, all his pain, all his failure, all his desperation. He got the role, and in March 1954, Frank Sinatra won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The comeback was complete. He signed with Capitol Records. His voice, now deeper, rougher, more emotional, was perfect for the new style of music. He released In the Wee Small Hours in 1955, Songs for Swinging Lovers in 1956, Come Fly With Me in 1958, albums that are now considered the greatest work of his career. The kid who lost his voice at the Copper became the legend who defined the 1950s. But Frank never forgot that night at the Copacabana. For the rest of his life, even after he was back on top, even after he was more successful than ever, Frank carried that trauma. He had nightmares about it, would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced his voice was gone again. Before every single performance for the next 40 years, Frank would test his voice, sing a few notes in his dressing room, make absolutely sure it was still there. He never took it for granted again. Dean Martin said, after the Copper, Frank sang every show like it might be his last, because he knew it could be. In 1971, 21 years after the incident, Frank was performing at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. In the middle of My Way, Frank felt his throat tighten. For just a second, he thought it was happening again. He stopped singing, stood there in complete silence for about 5 seconds. The audience thought it was a dramatic pause, but his band members knew. They saw the panic flash across his face. Then Frank's voice came back. He finished the song to thunderous applause, but backstage, he was shaking uncontrollably. I thought it was over, he told Bill Miller, his longtime pianist. I thought I was back at that fucking nightclub, standing there with nothing coming out. But it didn't happen, Bill said. This time, Frank said. But what about next time? That's what trauma does. It stays with you. 20 years later, 40 years later, always waiting in the shadows, Frank Sinatra performed until 1995, 45 years after that night at the Copper, and he tested his voice before every single show, every single one. Look at that photograph one more time. Frank Sinatra, April 26, 1950, Copacabana nightclub, mouth open, voice gone. This is the moment that almost destroyed him, but it didn't, because Frank Sinatra was too stubborn to stay destroyed. He lost everything that night, his voice, his dignity, his belief in himself, but he got up the next day, and the day after that, and kept going. When doctors said his voice might never fully recover, he worked on it until it did, differently, but better. When Hollywood rejected him, he fought his way back in through the side door. When critics wrote him off as finished, he won an Oscar and redefined American music. The voice that failed at the Copper became the voice that defined a generation, because Frank Sinatra learned something that night that most people never learn. Rock bottom isn't the end, it's the foundation you build your comeback on. His voice changed after 1950. It was deeper, rougher, more textured, wounded, and most critics agree it was better, because the smooth, effortless crooner voice was beautiful, but the damaged, rebuilt voice had something the old one didn't: truth, pain, experience, soul. Frank Sinatra had to lose his voice to find his real voice. And that's the lesson. Sometimes you have to lose everything, to discover what you're truly made of. Frank discovered he was made of steel, wrapped in velvet, wrapped in whiskey and cigarette smoke. That kid from Hoboken who stood on stage in complete silence, he came back stronger than anyone thought possible, and became immortal. If this story just showed you the side of Frank Sinatra you never knew existed, hit that subscribe button right now, because next week, we're revealing the truth about Frank's most violent confrontation, the night in Australia when he nearly started an international incident after a journalist insulted Ava Gardner, the attack that almost got him arrested in a foreign country, the rage that showed the world Frank Sinatra's darkest side, the moment that proved Frank would destroy anyone who threatened what he loved. This channel exposes the stories Hollywood buried, the moments of weakness that led to greatness, the truth about the legends who defined American culture. Subscribe to Frank Sinatra, The Untold Legacy, and turn on notifications. Hit that like button if this comeback story inspired you, and comment below, have you ever lost something you thought defined you? How did you rebuild? Because Frank's story proves that losing everything isn't the end, it's just the beginning of your real story. See you next week.